Oregon State has a chance to do something that they've only done twice in their program's history tomorrow in the Las Vegas Bowl against Florida. And it's really important for the Pac-12 as well. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with our beloved Conference of Champions. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. And our friends at BetOnline have got Oregon State sitting as a 10-point favorite against Florida as they're on the cusp of doing something not seen since 2009 in Corvallis. No better guy to talk about that with than my man Carter Bahns, senior writer and editor at beaverblitz.com. Carter, I want to start with what the Pac-12 needs here, and then we'll get into why it's so meaningful for Oregon State. But as you look forward beyond even 2023, which could be just an epic season of football in the Pac-12, Coach Prime in his first year, Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams there, who knows what Chip will have at UCLA, Oregon, Washington, Utah, Oregon State, all looking good. Again, when Washington State is like your 7th or 8th best team, you have quite the conference there. But as you look beyond that, the Pac-10, without USC and UCLA, needs teams to start to establish themselves. It's why Coach Prime is such an important hire at Colorado. But if you ask George K., even though they're not in a big TV market, they don't draw huge ratings, if you asked him, would you like Oregon State to be a perennial 7-9 with an occasional 10-win season in there as a team? I think that adds a lot of value to the conference, and Jonathan Smith's got a chance to start that here in the bowl game.
The more teams that you can get close to, if not at 10 or more wins, the better. And, you know, regardless of what their TV market looks like, how big their fan base is, the more wins you can rack up for your conference is always a good thing. And I think that you mentioned with USC and UCLA being a part of that top tier in the Pac-12 this year, that's why it's important for schools like Oregon State, Colorado, Washington State, Cal and Stanford, even down the line, to build up a little bit and to carry their weight, because you can't have half of the Pac-12, soon to be Pac-10, struggling to get to 6 wins. You need as many of your schools to be in the limelight in bowl season at the end of the year, winning games and getting on ESPN and Fox and whatever else the Pac-12 decides to do media rights wise. You need to have as much exposure for your conference as you can get if you're losing those two brand names in USC and UCLA. And obviously the only thing you can do to help your case there is win.
It creates a void, right? I think USC a little bit more so than UCLA, at least in the football sense. Once we get to talking about basketball, which I know is not something either of us, frankly, are keen on discussing at this point in time. So let's keep it on the gridiron. You're looking at losing your biggest football brand in USC, but also a team that even when Clay Helton was there and things weren't going great, they bottomed out in the 4-8 season, right? And then that's when they let him go early in that year in 2021. But even the quote unquote not good years, he had a Rose Bowl victory that included a Pac-12 championship. And, a bad season was like 8-5, and just having them there was valuable. So it creates, I think, a void at the top of you need teams to elevate and rise into it. Because the worst case scenario for, what is currently the Pac-10 beyond 2023 would be USC and UCLA leave, and then let's say Oregon, Washington, and Utah continue to be, 3 of the higher level teams, but then everyone else is just middling. You can't have that. Right? You'd love for Colorado and Coach Prime to get up into that upper echelon in a few years. But you need more teams to be there, right? The Pac-12 has had such a great season because you look at the final college football playoff rankings, And half the league is in the top 20. It's like 6 of the top 20. They haven't had that I don't think they've ever had that since the college football playoff rankings began. You have to have teams and programs that can be there. And Oregon State, looking at this opportunity against Florida, Carter, has got a chance to really put themselves in that discussion. I think they're there, right? They do so many things well. Smith is a great coach. He's built it up. It's been slow and methodical and quiet. Again, I still don't know what his voice sounds like. You give me 20 coaches' voices without faces, and I wouldn't know which one Jonathan Smith is. But he's starting to win. And if he can keep Oregon State competitive year in and year out, I think they can be like what Wisconsin is to the Big Ten. I think, every few years you might regress and have 6-6, but you're not surprised when they win 8 to 10 games every year. I think that's what Oregon State can be if Smith keeps them going right here.
Yeah, a lot of our discussions this offseason after the news that UCLA and USC were going to bolt broke surrounded around what Oregon State can do to maintain relevancy, to remain in the Pac-10/12 moving forward and not fall down to the Mountain West, and all of these worst case scenarios that a lot of Oregon State fans, frankly, were dwelling on. And the key for Oregon State was you have to win, because that's the only way to get yourself in the national conversation.
Yep.
And B, you have to invest in football. And what Oregon State has done this year, winning 9 games in the regular season, having a chance to post one of its 3 best seasons in program history if it wins the bowl game, and then rebuilding half of its stadium, investing in Jonathan Smith, giving him what is going to be almost $5.5 million at the end of his new 6-year contract that will run through nearly the end of the decade. Oregon State has checked all of the boxes it needed to over the course of the last 4 months. So I think the Beavers and that athletic department, that football program, that university, they've really done everything in their power to kind of position themselves in a favorable way for this next, I guess, era of the Pac-12 conference.
And it's not as if, losing this game to Florida would mean the downward trajectory and the loss of all of it. But I think the upside of winning is greater than the downside of losing. But from an Oregon State perspective, you want to win the game. And from a Pac-12 perspective, you want to see them win this game, because you've got 5 teams with 9 or more wins. Can you imagine if 4 of them, maybe 3, let's say 3 of them win their games that are currently at 9 or more wins, you would end up, because USC, Utah, and Washington are already there, with at least 4, probably 5 teams with double-digit wins. That's what you need. You need to have that sort of depth in the conference going forward if you're going to stay relevant in people's minds on the national stage outside of the Pac-12, right? Because that's what we're talking about here. How do you get on people's radars? How do you get on recruits' radars? How do you get on media people's radars, so that you can have a Heisman Trophy winner like Caleb Williams, but obviously being at USC helps tremendously. But you have to have that. And I like what you brought up about the investment, because a lot of times programs that are smaller, that don't have, huge money behind it, like an Oregon State or a Colorado, frankly, have had problems in the past of, it kind of feels like settling. It felt like they were settling for Gary Anderson, and it felt like they were, settling for Carl Durrell at Colorado. But now it feels different. You've got the right guy in Corvallis and Jonathan Smith. You're making an investment into Coach Prime at Colorado. That represents, to me, a shift in mindset. And that's what you need to have, because I think that's what's been lacking. And I think we've all kind of felt that. And I want your thoughts on that. And I'm also going to want your thoughts on Oregon State being a 10-point favorite against an SEC team. Imagine saying that phrase circa 2018. Yeah. Wouldn't have happened then, but it's happening now. It's well-deserved. We'll talk about why. And it is that number of 10, according to our friends at Bet Online, which has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to college bowl season, our favorite, to basketball and the World Cup. We've got it all at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline is where the game starts. So, Carter, just piggyback off of what I was talking about a moment ago, and what it means for Oregon State fans to be on the precipice of something they've only accomplished twice in their program's history, and let it be known, not that he needed to be even more of a legend for Beavs fans, but if Oregon State wins this game, of their 3 10-win seasons, 2 of them would have involved Jonathan Smith. Coincidence? I think not.
I actually talked about this earlier today on a radio hit that I did, that 2 of Oregon State's best seasons have come with Jonathan Smith being responsible for them, and one of them as a quarterback and one of them as a coach. And I think that just goes to show, like, he is a guy who knows how to win at Oregon State, what it looks like, how to sell it, most importantly, but also just how to replicate it, because Oregon State wasn't used to winning for almost more than half a decade before he came in. But he built the program in a way, I think, very similar to how Mike Riley did it when the Beavers had all that success, sustained success for a decade to open the century. To go back to the commitment to success and everything, part of this new contract that was just announced for Jonathan Smith on Sunday is the addition to the assistant coaching and support staff salaries. And I think that's a key part of this too, because Oregon State has really maintained a vast majority really of its coaching staff that Jonathan Smith brought in 2018. And a big part of that is because it's been willing to pay it more. We saw the extension and the raise given to Trent Bray a couple of weeks ago. And I think that's so key at a place like Oregon State, where player development is critically important. You're not bringing in 4- and 5-star guys. You're relying on your coaches to get the most of 3-star guys. And the fact that Oregon State continues to funnel more and more money into its assistant staff is, that again just goes back to the commitment to winning, which, again, like you said, with
Colorado.
I can't remember. Yeah, with Colorado. I mean, it's not something that we've seen in the last couple of years from these schools, but we're seeing it this year at Oregon State. And I think, when you combine that with the wins that have started to pile up, and the fact that Oregon State could win number 10 here, there is nothing but excitement and optimism in Corvallis, and rightfully so.
And symbolism does matter in this sport, and perception matters in this sport. And if you're Jonathan Smith, and the Beavs will be looking for a quarterback in the transfer portal, a lot of names have been thrown around. Unfortunately, I did my best to speak Cade McNamara into existence. It did not materialize, but a lot of names have been thrown out there. But when you look at what it means to Oregon State fans, Carter, to put up a 10 in the win column, for all the people who say, well, bowl season's this and bowl season's that, yeah, don't tell that to Oregon State fans, because I have a feeling, Carter, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not going to be listening to it, even though Florida has a lot of opt-outs in this game, as we're going to get to in just a moment. Am I wrong to speculate that Oregon State fans have a sense of excitement and pressure a little bit on this game?
Absolutely. And it's not just the fans, it's the players too. I can tell you there are multiple players on this team who had the opportunity to leave last year, but came back because they had such a bitter taste in their mouth from how they played in the LA Bowl last year. Brandon Kipper is a guy who comes to mind, who all year was talking about how his offensive line and the offense as a whole and the team didn't perform up to expectations, lost to Utah State, was thoroughly outplayed. And that was a key factor in his decision to come back, because he wanted to get to a better bowl, play against a higher caliber opponent, and win the game. So
all of which happened, by the way.
Exactly.
Well, the last one we'll see, but for the first 2 boxes, check and a check.
Right. So it's the players, it's the coaches, it's the entire fan base. And one of the things that we've been talking about at Beaver Blitz the last week or two since Florida was announced as the opponent. Sure, Anthony Richardson's not playing. Sure, there's 23, 24, or 25 guys opting out of this game. But people aren't going to remember that 5 to 10 years from now.
Nope.
They're going to remember that Oregon State notched its first ever win against an SEC opponent. If the Beavers win, it would be their first win over an SEC opponent. People are going to remember that Oregon State played Florida, that the game was in Vegas. They're not going to remember who lined up for the Gators. And that's so key to this because, for a program like Oregon State to get over the hump, it has to prove that it belongs. And what better way to prove that you belong than to beat an SEC opponent in a bowl game? I don't know. I think I just think that there's so much riding on it, even though Florida's not an Alabama or whatnot, and this is the Vegas Bowl, not the Rose Bowl. Like, this has the opportunity to generate even more momentum.
Yeah, I think Oregon State still has a number of goals they'd like to reach with Jonathan Smith at the helm going forward that they haven't yet. But a 10-win season, no matter how you get it, literally no matter how you get it, you can't overlook the value of that to a team, to an alumni base, to a fan base as well, and people who support the team, for a program that won one game 5 years ago. One single game, and let's be honest, Carter, they shouldn't even have won that game. Like
3 points against Portland State, yeah.
It should have been a goose egg. It should have been a goose egg season. And when you bottom out like that, there is 100% legitimate value in an opportunity like this. And let's just get into a real quick game preview with it looming tomorrow. 10-point favorite for the Bees. Right around that number, may vary depending on where you look. That's what they've got according to our friends at Bet Online. I think the opt-outs are a part of that. The line opened smaller and has moved out as players announced they weren't going to play. But the other thing, Carter, with regards to your point about the SEC and the opt-outs is, number one, the SEC brand is such, and it's so glorious and so amazing. And in a number of ways, I do agree with that. But however, do you think an SEC fan has never said in an argument, we could put out our third team and beat a team from the Pac-12 and this, that, and the other thing? And I bet also, Carter, that if you were to look at recruiting rankings of the players who are going to be playing in this game, even with all the opt-outs, I bet you it still favors Florida. But Oregon State, I think, is the favorite for a reason. I think they're the much more motivated team. I think the Bees could cover that 10 points. I really, really do. I don't think Florida is that good of a team. They're traveling a lot further than Oregon State is. I feel pretty confident about what the Bees can do here. And look, I know they knocked off Utah, but that was all Anthony Richardson, and he's not playing in this game.
Well, I mean, it just means more in the SEC, right? So, like, why are these guys opting out? Why is this fan base checking out saying, oh, we don't care about the Vegas Bowl? I mean, it just means more. So, no, that's obviously being facetious. But Florida, I think, is still dialed in. There are guys who are opting for the draft who are going to play in this game. Gervin Dexter, the defensive lineman there at Florida, who is probably their best defensive player, is headed to the draft, but said that he will play in this game, which I think is key for the Gators there. Because a lot of the guys who have opted out or entered the portal or who have been dismissed from the team, most of those guys weren't key starters. Anthony Richardson, of course, at quarterback is a big one, but most of those other guys were special teamers and reserve types. So I think Florida's still got quite a bit of talent coming into this game. You mentioned it with the backup situation. A lot of those guys are former 3, 4, 5 stars. These aren't walk-ons that are lining up against Oregon State. And, that oftentimes I think SEC backups probably have, a little bit more star power to them than Pac-12 backups. But regardless, I think it's a good matchup for Oregon State. The Beavers are far and away going to be the more motivated team here. And I think the fan base there in Las Vegas as well will lean heavily orange in Oregon State's favor.
I expect the Bees to show up. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Is there a direct flight from which airport is there a Corvallis Airport?
Eugene.
Yeah, they fly. Yeah, there's a direct flight from Las Vegas to Eugene. Yeah. I was on it not long ago. It's a Southwest flight, so it's not going to cost you too much to go down there. I'd expect at least a solid showing from the Bees fans. Obviously, it's not going to be a sold-out crowd or anything because Florida probably not going to send quite as many with a 6-6 season under their new coach, Billy Napier. But yeah, I agree with a lot of what you were just saying there. And I think the other thing too is Florida has had their moments this year where they've looked like that sort of team that we thought they might be after they beat Utah in week 1, but then they've had too many moments where they've looked not like that team. And I'm with you on the motivation factor. I think it's just so much higher for Oregon State. Like for Florida going 7-6 versus 6-7, they do not care as much as Oregon State would being 9-4 versus being 10-3 to end the 2022 season. There's another bowl game that is taking place tomorrow, and it involves Washington State. And they're playing the Mountain West champs, which is the game that Oregon State was in a year ago, in Fresno State. That program has got more on the line individually, I'd say, than the conference ramifications we talked about with the Beavs in this game. I will tell you why after I tell you that, let's say you're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end, people start to head out. You think of calling for a ride, but nah, you live nearby. You can make it home. It's okay. It's no big deal. You're wrong to think those sorts of things. What are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, lose your job, total your car, kill someone. All those things are possible. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still somehow doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now, night after night, looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Drive sober or get pulled over. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. Only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. This message brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. All right, the other bowl game that I'm excited for, and I think the conference ramifications are not quite as significant on the whole. However, that does not mean there isn't something Washington State is playing for here, and that'd be their most wins, Carter, since 2018. Also the last time under Mike Leach, who we very much hope is okay and is able to recover. We're recording this a little bit earlier in the week, so hopefully good news on that front. Washington State hasn't won a bowl game since 2018. They haven't been ranked since 2018. They haven't had an 8-win or greater season since 2018. And in year 1 for a head coach, talking about this a lot with Jonathan Smith as well, it means something to be able to put up a number like that at a program that does not have a rich tradition of winning.
Yeah, and I think it's important too where Washington State is in this quote unquote rebuild. This isn't the type of rebuild that Oregon State is on. Not
it's
even
a
remotely
rebuild.
the same.
It's a rebuild-ish.
Yeah, not even remotely
ish.
the same trajectory. Jake Dickert comes in and inherits a program that was already winning 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 games a year.
Yeah.
But it's about him establishing his culture, his brand of football, getting his assistants in line. And I think to have this early success in his tenure would go a long way in doing that. I think having tangible success that you can point to early in your career, especially when you're coming in as a former interim coach, somebody who had no head coaching experience, I think that goes a long way in being able to sell your product, of course, particularly to recruits, but also importantly to boosters as well. So having those successful years early on, being able to take advantage of what was left by the previous coaching staff, because it's not like this program was in shambles when Rolovich and his other assistants that didn't stay on left. It's important for Dickert.
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating game because you've got two teams whose identities come on opposing sides of the ball, but whose, quote unquote weaker side has shown glimpses this year. That Fresno State game against Oregon State back all the way in week 2, which feels like a lifetime ago. They did allow the game-losing touchdown there at the end, but for long stretches of that game, it was tough for the Beavs to move the ball. And it looked like, they came out early, they had some points, and it was going to be, kind of smooth sailing. And then all of a sudden they put the clamps down. But by far, the most fascinating matchup in this game, Carter, is Jake Haener, who comes in red hot, Mountain West Championship, 9-4 Fresno State team that looked like their season was kind of lost at one point, and he was hurt, but since he's come back, they've been really rolling. and they're going up against that Washington State defense that now doesn't have their defensive coordinator. He's down at ASU. Brian Ward is joining Kenny Dillingham and that staff, which I think is a great hire if you're Dillingham building out his first staff there in Tempe. So Dickert will be calling the defensive plays, and he's a former defensive coordinator, so I don't think that'll be too much of a problem there. But I think that's just such a compelling matchup in itself. Just Washington State defense. How do you try and contain a guy like Jake Haener?
Jake Haener remains, I think, one of the most underrated quarterbacks in the country. I think he is going to have a pretty nice professional career. I hope that somebody takes a shot on him, and
I do too.
And gives him
He's just
a
a
chance
baller.
there.
He just goes out there. You know what he wants to do, Carter? He just wants to go out there and play football. Every week, that's what I see. I'm like, man, that guy just wants to play football.
And he wins games too. He's done nothing but win since he went to Fresno State. And of course, unfortunately, suffered the injury in the middle of the year, but it proved how important he is to that team because they really struggled without him. And so obviously it's key that he gets back in there, but he does have a tough matchup. I have seen both Haener and the Washington State defense firsthand this year, and I know how good both of those sides are. Haener was able to move the ball against Oregon State's defense, which went down as one of the best, if not the best, in the Pac-12 this year. Of course, Oregon State's secondary, one of the best in the country. Jake Haener was able to move the ball. They scored 30-plus points in that game. So I think the pressure, frankly, is on the Washington State defense in this one. The firepower that the Bulldogs have on offense, they've got the name recognition there. Washington State, I know, has some all-conference guys. Dan Henley is a solid player. But people on the East Coast know Jake Haener's name, I think, by now. I don't think there's a player on that Washington State defense that has gotten some of the national headlines and notoriety that Jake Haener has. So curious to see how they perform against each other. I think it's a great matchup. The LA Bowl last year was fun to watch between Oregon State in the middle of the Pac-12 versus Utah State as the Mountain West champion. I think this is a great matchup moving forward. The Mountain West gets better and better. The Pac-12 as a deep league is always going to field a good team in that middle range as long as it remains this deep. This will be another fun matchup to watch. And I think this bowl is going to continue to produce good ones.
Let's do some quick game predictions here, and we'll begin with Oregon State and Florida in the Vegas Bowl. I think the Bees are going to cover that 10 points, Carter. I think Florida hangs around initially, but for a team whose motivation level I 100% question across the board. Now, you could have guys who are playing that haven't done a ton this year in terms of seeing action on the field, and they could be a bit more juiced to, get an opportunity to play. But then you're playing guys who are not quite as experienced. So I don't think there's a real winning hand there for Florida on that front. And I think eventually, I think Oregon State can just wear them down with Damian Martinez. That's been their formula. And I think for a team that's questioning that I question in terms of their motivation going into the game, I think that's just a demoralizing feeling. Just 5, 4, 7, 5, 4, 7 yards on the ground, just over and over again. I think Oregon State gets this done. And without Anthony Richardson at quarterback, I've got no faith in that Florida offense whatsoever. So I'll take the Beavs pretty comfortably here. I'm going to go 28-13.
I like it. Yeah, I think Oregon State scores more than 28 in this game. Florida has one of the worst run defenses in the country. Oregon State has one of the best rushing offenses, has a great offensive line. Damian Martinez, like you said, could average 6, 7, 8 yards per carry in this game. I think he's going to find pay dirt a couple of times. And I think Oregon State's going to post a bunch of points in this thing. The key for Florida is, can it keep up? And I just don't know if I can trust a third-string quarterback to do that, particularly when he has never started a game. I know he's a former Ohio State guy. He was a pretty solid recruit out of high school, but
inexperience against the Oregon State secondary. Say that out loud and then try and pick Florida.
Yeah, it would be scary to project much from the Florida offense there. I do think, like we said earlier, Florida is still going to have a lot of talent in this game. Some of those guys will be very motivated. But when your team as a whole is not as motivated as your opponent in a bowl game, that oftentimes shows up. That's where you start to see some of those blowouts. And so I do think this has blowout potential in Oregon State's favor. But I do think there's a path to Florida being very competitive in this game and potentially pulling some sort of upset. But I wouldn't predict that. I think Oregon State wins it by probably a touchdown and a field goal to 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, I think the only path that Florida would have is put 8 guys in the box and force Ben Gulbranson to beat you, and I think that is the only option that they've got. And even then, I don't know if they've got that. And that Oregon State secondary against a guy who hasn't started a college football game, yeah, I'll take the Beavs on that side. The other one's tough. I've been a Washington State defender all season long. I had their preseason record prediction right on the money, Carter. They were the best team that I put in the Pac-12 prime picks consistently. They were like the only good pick I consistently had. I think it was 4-1 or 4-2 when including them in there in some form or another. I don't know on this one. Here's the biggest question of the game. Can Washington State run the football? Because that's been the key to their offense all year. In games where they run the football, Arizona, Stanford, they win. And they look like a really good team doing it. And I think you could have that. But I just keep coming back to, man, that dude, Jake Haener. That dude, Jake Haener. Correct me if I'm wrong. It'll be his last college football game.
Yep.
I'm rooting for the Cougs 100%. And I would love to see him get this win. But I think they're going to drop it. I think Fresno State wins in a little bit of a shootout. I think it looks a little bit like the Washington game, but closer at the end. I think Haener makes a play. I'll go 34-30 Fresno State.
That sounds about right. I think it's a little lower scoring than that.
All right. I think that would favor Washington State. If you told me lower scoring, that's Washington State's MO.
And that's where I'm going with this, because I think, you look at the two teams and how they match up against each other. You have a really good offense at Fresno State versus a really good defense at Washington State, and a not so good defense at Fresno State against, a kind of an average offense at Washington State. More often than not, if that is the case, I'm going to lean with the side that has the advantage on defense, and that is Washington State. I go back to what I saw when Oregon State and Fresno State played, and I just think, if Fresno State couldn't slow down Oregon State's offense, which didn't turn out to be much of anything this year, I'm kind of questioning what it could do against Cam Ward and some of those legitimate playmakers that the Cougs have on offense as well. So I think the Cougs have enough talent to overcome the Jake Haener effect. He's a gamer, he's a winner, and it makes it really scary to pick the Cougs here, because the guy just finds ways to win games. Probably should have beaten Oregon State if not for that late comeback and a Coletto miracle touchdown at the end. But I think the Cougs get this one and even up the all-time series in this bowl at 1-1 for the Pac-12.
I hope you are right for the sake of the conference, of course. I would love for them to go 5-2. That would be a great bowl season for the league, and I think they're playing for a lot. When you have a great regular season like this, you want to be able to back it up in bowl season and put out as many 10-win teams as you can. Carter Bahns, senior writer and editor at beaverblitz.com, will be crossing his fingers and then some and biting nails in front of the television tomorrow as the Beavs go for their third 10-win season in program history. Carter, great to talk to you, as always, my friend.
Hey, I'll be there. I'll be in Vegas.
Hey, even better.
As this thing airs, I'm probably at a press conference or a casino.
Fantastic. I might have to see you there. I might have to see you there. We'll talk off the air. But good to talk to you as well. Thank you everyone for listening. See you next time and have a wonderful rest of your day.